So I've arrived back in Australia and I've been in Europe for 6 months, and I just thought I'd talk about the pandemic. So controversial. So yeah, I left in May. It was pretty good timing for me, the Europe trip, because things seemed to be getting better in Europe by the time I arrived and worse in Australia. And now that I'm back, it seems to be getting worse in Europe. So the first drama I had to deal with was getting permission to leave the country. A lot of Europeans don't believe that you would need this, and they also don't believe that you couldn't go home again when you feel like it if you're a citizen and resident of the country. But that's the way it is in Australia. So yeah, I had to get permission to leave. It was granted straight away, but the fact that you need to get permission made me pretty hesitant to come back to Australia in case I didn't get permission the next time I wanted to leave. And then I had to get a PCR test before leaving. I also managed to get my first Pfizer shot, which I didn't even consider trying to get because we were pretty behind with vaccinations, and I thought being not being old or in a risk group, it wouldn't be able to get it, but I managed to get that just before I left. The PCR test cost me $150, which is pretty annoying, but it was also very inconvenient because basically no one was PCR testing in Brisbane because there was basically no cases. I had to go to a commercial place that does it just for travel specifically, and that was only one in all of Brisbane basically, so it was a long way to get there. And in Europe, when I did need the PCR to check in at the airport in Brisbane, but when I arrived in Europe, I was like, oh, don't you want to see my PCR test? This is in Switzerland, Zurich. I said, oh no. Oh, yeah, show me. So it's much harder to police border movements in Europe, obviously, given the geography and all the countries around, than it is in Australia and New Zealand, where you've got a big ocean around you. So I tried getting my vaccination in Switzerland, my second shot, and they had heaps of doctors, heaps of shots, no queue, but they couldn't do it because I don't have a local healthcare card. So also tried in Italy. It seemed like a lot of bureaucratic hoops to jump. Finally, I got it in France after a couple of months, and actually it was quite a few months. So it was a bit later than the optimal waiting time after the first dose. But I just walked into a clinic, and I think it was just because the medical people there were actually just going to make it work for me. I don't know how much it was the government policy and the bureaucracy allowing it to happen. I think they basically just pretended that my first shot was in Europe to make things easier on the bureaucracy side, but it's a bit hard to say. So I don't know how lucky I was to be able to get the second vaccination. And yeah, personally, I'm not worried about the risk of COVID to me. I think the main problem with COVID is that it increases your chance of getting sick. So if you are vulnerable or aged, you're much more likely to die in the next 2 weeks than the similar likelihood of what you would be dying in the next year or two without COVID. So it increases the load on the health system if everyone dies all at once instead of over the year spread out. And obviously the economy, because it changes our behaviour. But personally, I'm not too worried about it. It's not very nice. For most people, they get pretty crook. But I'm not worried about dying. But it does make life a lot easier if you have the QR code. So that was the main incentive for me to get it. And so you do need to use the QR code a fair bit. A lot of businesses will ignore it, but if you want to do things like go on public transport in Italy, or go to places like museums and stuff like that, you're scanning that QR code. So sometimes I would not use it at all for a week or two, and other times I'd be using it quite a bit. Definitely would make your life a lot harder to not be vaccinated, but I know people in Europe that aren't vaccinated, and they're travelling to, like, from Switzerland to the Caribbean and UAE, and they have to get more PCR tests than someone without a vaccination. But yeah, it's very complicated. That's one of the dramas with it, is you have to always check what the specific rules are in the specific country you're leaving or going to, and also they can change at the last minute, as they did when I came back to Australia with Omicron. It wasn't a major change, but I had to do a 3-day home quarantine, which I wouldn't have had to do if I'd arrived a week before. So yeah, coming back, there was a bit of a drama. I got a PCR test. I wanted to do it in Italy because it's cheaper, and I was leaving from Italy, but it was completely booked out in the town I was staying at. So I thought I better get it done in Switzerland for 3 times the price, 160 francs. And that was a walk-in service. I didn't have to book it. Yeah, they're pretty good at making money in Switzerland. But when I got back to Italy, or actually on the bus, I found out, my brother told me that Emirates doesn't actually accept PCR tests from a different country than the one you're leaving from, even if it's within the validity period. So I was like, well, I'm pretty stuffed, because that's the only option I have. It was pretty annoying paying 3 times the price and still taking the risk that it actually wasn't valid according to the website. But luckily, they overlooked that. I did try and get a second PCR test in Como anyway. I just walked into the places, but it was impossible. So my problem with the PCR test, I don't really like people sticking things up your nose, and I don't like paying for that. But the main thing is the huge risk that you take, that if you test positive, it's going to screw up all your plans. So for travel, it obviously, you're going to rethink whether you really need to travel, which is probably the intention anyway. Yeah, so with Omicron, it seems like it's a more contagious variant, and it also is probably, depending on who you talk to, too early to say, but it's less severe. The symptoms aren't as bad. It's less likely to kill you. So basically, it's like a vaccination, and it's come from Africa, where they've got lower vaccination rates. It's more likely to be able to mutate if it can. I mean, this is what happened with the what was it called, the pandemic they had just after the First World War, I think it was. That it mutated into a less severe form, and then it basically just went away. So that could be happening. So we're in the midst of vaccination and all the dramas of, are we getting enough vaccinations to the countries that need it, or do those countries even want to get it? Like, a lot of people have got different cultural beliefs and they don't want to inject things into their body. Even people in the West say that. So even in Australia, where there's very high vaccination rates, people were holding off and not wanting to be the guinea pigs and trying to wait and see first. So we're in the midst of that, and now we've got a variant. Like, who didn't think this would happen? Like, of course, the virus is going to mutate, and whether the vaccinations will be able to keep up with it or not. Yeah, I don't know. I just think that Australia and New Zealand are always going to be years behind places like Europe, just because geographically they're isolated, so they can, delay things longer with getting it. And just the attitudes over here, people would lock down forever. But I think if people thought about, now that you need to have a QR code to borrow a library book or whatever, if they thought about this a year ago, it's just because it's very gradual, all these changes happening, and if people thought that they wouldn't be able to travel for 2 years straight up, it's scope creep. It's all these things are changing bit by bit, and people think, oh yeah, but it's temporary, and just around the corner the vaccine will fix everything. But I think it could be going on in years and years that we'll still have lockdowns, or vaccinations and boosters and PCR tests and all this kind of thing. And I think it's going to go. It's never going to go away, but it's going to be more pragmatic in places like Europe than Australia and New Zealand. So yeah, when I travelled back to Australia, I was thinking, let's see how much of a hassle this is, and whether I actually want to do it again, because I might just bail and go to somewhere, live somewhere else, because this pandemic is a long-term thing. And yeah, the other thing is that because you're forced to do, PCR tests or vaccinations or whatever, and a lot of people don't want to do that, they can't really get around it apart from just isolating themselves from society, because can't go to restaurants or travel or do anything, or by faking it. So I think there's a lot of forgery going on, and yeah, they're the main things that I wanted to talk about. I think I suppose I better finish my breakfast, but yeah, the other thing is, it's so annoying that there's nothing on the news apart from pandemic this, pandemic that, pandemic this, pandemic that. And there is more important things going on, like climate change is something that is happening over, decades, but it's already happening now. And it is way, 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 way more important than, 0.0 something % of people. The thing is, people die. People die anyway. And my other point is, with the vaccinations, we've waited over a year for this. In that time, a lot of people who would have died from COVID may have died waiting, and in that time never been able to see their grandkids and all that. But definitely, I think COVID is for sure real. It does, it can kill you, and if not, it can make you pretty sick, and it's pretty awful. But there is no solution that is going to take things back to how they were. At some point, you're going to have to compromise, whether it's with your health and taking risks of you might catch it, or just compromising the rest of your lifestyle. But it definitely seems that in the West, we have gone down the China route of being very controlling and trying to eliminate COVID at all costs. And maybe that's the right way to go, but I think everyone's talking about what's happening now, but most people aren't having a realistic think about what the next several years is going to look like. And there's a couple of big hairs outside. They're thinking that this is going to go away, but I think if you're more realistic, you should just think, well, not much is going to change very fast in the next few years, and maybe you should change some things to adapt to the new world. Just a couple of things I forgot to mention. So in Dubai, I had a pretty good experience, because at the expo there, they were doing free PCR tests for anyone who was going to the expo. So that meant I didn't have to pay. And actually, it was really fast. They said 4 to 6 hours, and it was just under 4 hours. And I did the test at 6 p.m. And they also had PCR testing at the hotel, which makes a lot of sense, that you don't have to drive for an hour across town like you did in Brisbane, or have it completely booked out like it was in Italy. But actually, some people had trouble getting their results back in the 24 hours that they promised, so dramas. And also, I had a friend that was going to join me on that trip, but she wasn't able to get her QR certificate despite being fully vaccinated. She's an Australian living in Sweden, and just the bureaucratic dramas. So, yeah, I realised after an experience before I left in Australia that all this has got nothing to do with, getting sick or passing on the disease or blah, blah, blah. It's all about whether you have the right piece of paper. So, no use trying to argue with the officials and explain that it's reasonable or whatever. Logic doesn't matter. It's all about the bit of paper.